Now, let's have a conversation about the Horn of Africa and what's been happening in the Horn of Africa. There was a press release that was issued yesterday by the Human Rights Watch about what's been happening in the Horn, the atrocities and all. And it's actually titled, this particular press release. I had it.
As you're looking for it, why don't I welcome the guest to the program?
Yes. No. I want to introduce the guest, but I want to introduce the topic.
Yes.
Okay. The Executive Director of Human Rights Watch Africa Division, Mausi Segun.
Well done.
Did I get it? Ndo?
You did.
I did that? Mausi, did I get it?
You did a good job.
Mausi Segun is our guest this morning. Good morning.
Good morning.
Welcome to the hot seat of the Situation Room.
Thank you for having me.
Karibu sana. Our sister from Nigeria told me earlier how to pronounce your name before you got in. So I got leakage. That's how come I was able to pronounce it that way. Karibu sana to Kenya. Nigerian by birth, Kenyan by choice. That's her.
That's her.
Nigerian by birth.
Nigerian by choice.
Nigerian by choice.
Always.
Okay. The press release yesterday was titled Horn of Africa, Impunity Fueling Abuses. Civilians are bearing the brunt of global inaction on wartime atrocities, humanitarian crises. We'll be talking about that shortly. To welcome you to the conversation, CT has the day's proverb. Every week, CT goes to one African country, picks proverbs from that country, and then he gives us a proverb a day. This week, the proverbs have been from the Republic of Kenya, and they've been in the Swahili language. Do you understand Swahili?
A little.
Good. He's going to give you the Swahili proverb. Let's see if you understand it.
This man is baiting you.
This is it. This is an ambush.
Yes, okay. Here we go. Asiekosa hayupo.
Completely clueless.
It's all right. Sister.
I struggled this morning as well.
And then you got it.
You didn't actually struggle.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't sure.
You're struggling with self-doubt, yet you knew.
Still a struggle.
You knew exactly what the problem meant.
Still a struggle. So, one who doesn't err, one who errs is alive. Is still human.
You know, you're actually very right.
Yeah.
You see, the proverb actually says there is no one who doesn't make a mistake.
Right. To err is human.
Yes, that's what it says. So you are right.
Thank you.
To err is human. Mausi, what's your interpretation of this?
It is embracing our humanity. We come with strengths and weaknesses, not only in ourselves, but to embrace it in others, and not to be so quick to judge. I think for me, it's that rush to judgment that we all must try to end. Just give each other the benefit of the doubt. Even if it's wrong, it could be a mistake.
Chiti?
You know, this is the beauty of listening to someone's interpretation. You always hear something new. And in many cases, spot on. So yes. But you see, a proverb of this nature exists against a backdrop of the assumption of certain people who find themselves in certain privileged positions that they are better. And that particular notion then lends itself to an attitude where you lash out and treat those who make mistakes or those who don't seem to do what you assume to be right in the most preposterous of ways. You are almost unforgiving. And yet you yourself have your own weaknesses and your own failings.
Indeed.
Yes.
So, Mausi, the Human Rights Watch has released the World Report 2024, which talks about various issues. Among them, that the Horn of Africa governments have grappled with rampant wartime atrocities and humanitarian crises throughout 2023 with meager international assistance. Unaddressed historical grievances and impunity for serious crimes continue to spur widespread violations against civilians in the region. And you go ahead now to talk about the various conflicts. We'll talk about this report. First, let's define what's the Horn of Africa.
Good question. The way that Africa is defined, the definition is imposed on us by others outside the continent. But when you look at the way the map is drawn, there is that sharp edge towards the east coast of Africa. That's the Horn. It's Djibouti, it's Eritrea, it's Somalia, it's Sudan, it's Ethiopia. So, but for the context of our report, when we're talking about the Horn and the crisis going on there, we're largely referring to Sudan and Ethiopia, and to some extent Eritrea, because it's been involved in the conflict in Ethiopia.
In Ethiopia as well. So we saw that conflict play out in Ethiopia. And then towards the end of the year as well, we saw the conflict erupt in Sudan and what has happened in those two countries. What's the situation at present with those two conflicts? Are they resolved? Are they ongoing? Are they reducing? Are they escalating?
Let's start with Ethiopia because there is a sense of normalization going on there. But the facts on the ground do not bear that out. The cessation of hostilities agreement in November 2022 has kind of taken hold. The crisis of the conflict in northern Ethiopia, that's in Tigray. And so to a large extent, the fighting has ended. However, ongoing human rights abuses by Eritrean forces who are still stationed in Tigray is a huge problem. They continue to carry out extrajudicial and other unlawful killings, sexual violence. They disturb and stop aid from reaching people who are desperately in need of it. That's Tigray. And then you come a little further south. In the Amhara region, in April last year, fighting broke out between Amhara militia called Fano and the federal government. Since then, the situation has escalated. The fighting continues and has showed no signs of abating till now. And so you have those two situations still simmering, and yet the international community has normalized relationship with the Ethiopian government, which is an active party in all of this.
What do you mean Ethiopia by normalized relations?
And so, for example, I'll give you the quick human rights perspective. There was an International Commission of Human Rights Experts set up by the UN Human Rights Council to investigate, monitor, and report and make recommendations on the situation in Tigray. By the last session in September, the mandate of that Commission of Experts expired, and Ethiopia worked really hard to ensure that it was not renewed. Worked through the African Union members and the other members of the Human Rights Council. Now, what that means, what he has presented is a transitional justice policy. However, on the ground, there is no policy. There has been no accountability for the horrible atrocities that we documented over the course of the conflict itself. And, all of the sanctions that were put in place to force Ethiopia to that point of signing the cessation of hostilities agreement have been largely taken off. And so where do people go from there? Those who have been victimized are still in pain. Those who have been displaced are still out there. And like I said, Eritrea remains there. Ethiopia, whatever transitional justice policy they put in place, is not going to affect Ethiopia. It's an Eritrea. It's another country. And the forces are still in Tigray as we speak.
Why are they still there?
That's a good question. Ethiopia continues to allow it.
Are they officially in
The
Tigray,
Ethiopian government is very much aware that Eritrean forces are still in there. They have not pushed them out. They have not asked them to leave. They must know, and that means complicity.
When we look at the characterization of conflict, whether it's in the Horn, which there are reservations about how, what you mentioned earlier, how this particular area has been characterized, one, and then secondly, how we continually see conflict unabated for decades in this area. What is different about how this conflict has been reported on and how conflicts in other parts of the world have been reported on to make us now say that there's little attention by the international community in the Horn?
So, the reporting is one thing. I think part of what the Ethiopian government did that made reporting really difficult was one very strong repression of independent journalists. Many were pushed out of the country, directly expelled. Those within the country were stopped from working, arrested. As we speak, many remain in detention. It's not exactly clear whether it's only for journalistic activities that these individuals are under arrest. Many are involved in some politicking. And so for that, we're not exactly sure, but they remain in detention. So there is constant harassment. And the shutdown of the internet, mobile telephone networks was shut down. It was almost impossible to get access to facts on the ground as they happened. Many of us relied on, different devices to reach the people and get the information out of there. Even humanitarian actors were pushed out of the country. Now, elsewhere, even if you don't have physical access, there is some level of remote access. So that's why I said the reporting is one part of it. But where we have also seen the double standards is that the international community made very little effort to ensure that there is a structure for civilian protection. There are people who do not have any skin in this fight. They are caught in between. A lot of vulnerable groups, women, children, older people, people with disabilities, people who really just maybe by the very accident of their birth happen to be from one ethnic group or the other. They are targeted for that simple reason. And there was no buffer. There was no protection for any of them. And like I said earlier, there is still no mechanism for accountability for the abuses and atrocities perpetrated against them. This, the international community has failed to do for the Ethiopian people who are victimized throughout the conflict.
Is it just not another example of how the international community then, and many would say, is excited at the prospect of conflicts remaining in Africa?
I don't know whether the word is excited. Because we as Africans, African people, African governments, we must take responsibility for what we do to ourselves.
Then we can't, if we say that, then it should concern us less whether the international community is involved or not.
But then you're not taking into consideration the unequal power relations between a state who has all of the machinery of power and the use of force against people who are completely unarmed and helpless. Who protects them? That's where there must be. And when I say international community, I'm not just talking about people outside of Africa. I'm talking about the African Union. I'm talking about the sub-regional mechanisms. There is IGAD, the Intergovernmental Development Authority. There is the East African Community. And all of these institutions, plus the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, the most significant human rights organ of the African Union. It started an investigation 2 years into the conflict, mysteriously decided to drop everything. No report was issued. We understand that the Ethiopian government was extremely hostile to its investigators, but still you have an obligation because you have a legal mandate to do this job to protect human rights on the continent. These Ethiopians who are suffering are Africans. Who protects them?
Are you saying that those regional bodies, IGAD, EAC, the AU, took zero action?
I wouldn't say zero.
There was no response? Just speaking in the case of Ethiopia, are you saying that the African Union did not take any action in the case of Ethiopia?
Inaction is a broad range. Condemning, publicly calling out, that is some action, and it has its utility at some level. But when it comes to pulling and pushing with some level of coercion, because no one who enjoys power will lay it down willingly or voluntarily. There has to be coercive measures to ensure that those who are helpless in all of this are protected.
Wouldn't you say that the African Union actually took steps to end the conflict?
I wouldn't say so. I think that they tried to have conversations with President Abiy, a lot of which he rebuffed. I think that the African Commission, like I said earlier, set up a commission of inquiry, but it was not allowed to function. The United Nations Human Rights Council eventually got into an agreement with Ethiopia's Human Rights Commission, and they were able to carry out some investigation, a lot of it under protestation from the Ethiopian government. They issued a report. The recommendations from that report and from the independent commission of experts set up by the UN Human Rights Council, none of it have been implemented.
Can we say it's work in progress? Look, I'm coming from this point. I'm coming from a point where memory serves me right. The various actors, even within Africa, who are active in trying to bring the two factions to a table, the Abiyani's government and the Tigray People's Liberation Front, and they ended up with conversations about a ceasefire, hostilities, so that you can allow humanitarian access. And this happened because of efforts being made at AU level, at regional level. There were conversations about, okay, let's end the hostilities. This was as a result of conversations that have been shepherded by the international community, countries outside of Ethiopia.
So those are political decisions. And ultimately, you're right, it did help to bring them to that point of ending hostilities eventually. But after much damage and hurt, and the persistent pain of those who have been victimized, that for me is failure. And I'm speaking from a human rights perspective. The right of the ordinary civilians who were caught amidst all of this. Not enough has been done to protect them. And that is the cycle of impunity encourages and emboldens those who would also want to perpetrate human rights abuses and violations. And those who are hurt will ultimately find an avenue to retaliate, carry out reprisals, take revenge, and it helps no one that there is no accountability. And that's where we say there is a failure of the international community.
When you say accountability, what form would you have wanted to see it? Let's talk about the entire 2023, when there was a cessation of hostilities in Tigray. What do you have wanted to happen that now brings in the rights of the ordinary civilians who were displaced, whose relatives were killed, whose livelihoods were destroyed by the conflict?
First would be that those who have been displaced are able to safely return. Those who have lost loved ones have their questions answered. What happened to them? This is really critical to those. That's one. And then the other part of it, especially when you look at the Western Tigray zone, that zone, I mean, it's been a zone of contestation between different ethnic groups in Ethiopia for decades. It's nothing new. But the conflict presented an opportunity that gave mostly the Amhara ethnic group an upper hand because they were fighting alongside federal forces. And they were able to push out and continue as we speak to drive out ethnic Tigrayans from Western Tigray. That continues to happen today. There is no accountability. Those who have left, they have nowhere to return to. They have no one taking care of their needs where they are. Many were pushed into Sudan, and we'll come to Sudan in a bit. Yep. Many were pushed into Sudan. Yep. Sudan now is in conflict, and they are being targeted in Sudan. So you have multiple layers of victimization, of abuses that people have no answer for. There is no accountability.
Some would argue that that's sort of, it's not desired, but it's like a natural cause of conflict. That is what happens. That once the warring armed conflict ends, the plight of the citizens just, is sort of forgotten. Not because of the inaction of the international community, even with the action of the international community, unless you're saying that people go in there and, shepherd people getting back home. In internal conflicts, that this is what happens, Mausi. This is, I mean, they are in the process of resettling those that were displaced. They're in the process of getting justice for those that were affected. It's an ongoing process. You seem to be putting an urgent
process that we
timeline.
don't see. It's that process. We need to see a clear commitment and indication that it's happening. Like I said earlier, Eritrean forces remain in Tigray, carrying out these same abuses, extrajudicial killing, other unlawful killings, rape, sexual violence against women and girls. It is continuing. There is no indication that there is a commitment, whether by the national government or the international community. Get Eritreans out. That's first. Let them go back to their country. Why are they still there? So that's not a consequence of the war. There are natural consequences that will take time, but it has to be progressive, and progress needs to be initiated.
And there has to be a roadmap.
That's it.
We've talked about Ethiopia. Also, Sudan. A lot is unfolding. What's happening in Sudan?
Sudan is still in the throes of the conflict that started now over about 7-8 months ago. We've seen continued fighting in Khartoum. For example, between the Sudan Armed Forces and the Rapid Support Forces. So, I mean, if you know the history of the transitional government in Sudan, the two leaders of these warring parties were together. The leader and the deputy leader of the transitional government, General Al-Burhan and General Amdallah Dagalo, known as Hemeti, easier to call him Hemeti. Men and their ego. It's an egotistical war, and they are fighting to the last to gain the upper hand. And unfortunately, ordinary Sudanese are caught in the midst of all of this. The essential infrastructure in Khartoum, as we speak, is almost completely destroyed.
What?
Health systems completely gone. Electricity, water, and there's still about 3 million people trapped in there. The Sudan Armed Forces are not allowing humanitarian aid to get in. People are desperate in those locations. And when you talk about Khartoum, you talk about the twin city Omdurman as well. In the areas where the Rapid Support Forces have control, they are, taking over people's homes, raping, pillaging, setting houses on fire, setting properties on fire, and that's Khartoum. Elsewhere in the country, in Darfur in particular, maybe let me zero in on West Darfur. Darfur, as you know, has a history of conflict from 20 years ago. A lot of it remains, again, unaccounted for. Over 200,000 people killed in that conflict. Very little in terms of holding perpetrators to account. And both the Sudan Armed Forces and the Rapid Support Forces in another iteration, then as part of the Janjaweed, were very active in that conflict then. So you have history repeating itself in Darfur. Right now, ethnic Masalit people are being targeted by the Rapid Support Forces led by Dagalo, and there are other Arab militia carrying out ethnically targeted killings of these people, forced displacement, pushing people out of their homes. Many Masalit people are right now in Chad as we speak. Some have fled into South Sudan, I think about 7 million people internally and externally displaced, with little access to help. It's a really desperate situation.
Are you seeing the international community again here is taking little action?
No, it's the paralysis of action when it comes to Sudan, I think, is somewhat surprising. The African Union indeed attempted to, sanction them, expelled Sudan from the African Union But beyond that, the United Nations has devolved responsibility to the African Union, and the African Union in turn devolved it to IGAD.
Yep.
And neither of them have been able to do anything much.
Have been able? I think have been able. I mean, I hear what you're saying, and I have my reservations about interventions by the African Union in Africa for decades, in terms of what can be done and what ought to be done, and what people are willing, what organizations that have been instituted for things like this to actually do. And I think over time, unfortunately, it's been wanting at best. Because I do feel that there are those who benefit from a situation where Africa is current and constantly in conflict. And that whereas we as Africans and we as the countries that constitute this continent have a responsibility for watching over one another, I think that we have dispelled that responsibility so much so that we are in a state where sometimes we do not even know what is going on. But at the same time, I do feel that there's external play in the conflicts that take place, because there's the recognition that an Africa without conflict is a threat of huge proportions, and that we cannot ignore that kind of intervention.
Or an Africa in turmoil is easy to exploit.
Absolutely.
Because you see, when you talk about external forces, are we saying that on this continent, we ourselves are phenomenal manufacturers of ammunition, warfare gadgets? No, we get them. Somebody gives them to us, or somebody sells them to us. Because when you have a prolonged war, somebody's making it possible. So yes, external influences do exist, but of the nefarious variety.
Absolutely.
And if you look at the history of that region has been embroiled in conflict for the longest. It's one conflict after another. There have been more periods of conflict than there have been periods of peace. Now, what does that do to the psyche of the people? See, if you are used to war more than peacetime, what do you think you are inclined towards? Should there be a problem? To have peace or to go to war? Yes.
I think that, to be fair, if you asked ordinary Sudanese, they want peace. They just want to live their lives. Every African, every human being, they just want to live their lives. They are not, majority of people are not interested in politics. The economics of it, yes. What puts food on their table, clothes on their back, the roof over their heads, they care about all of that. It's a small minority that are involved in politics or even having political opinions, right? But when we then talk about how long the conflicts have been, it's not everyone who is living in Sudan today who experienced the past. There are a lot of young people. This youth bulge that we're talking about is everywhere in Africa. Young people. I mean, Sudan in Africa is one of those countries where they have a very vibrant, highly educated, exposed population. Civil society, the media, professional groups, you saw how they held up against al-Bashir at the end of it and continued to remain on the streets even when the tanks were moving towards them. They organized themselves, whether it was teachers' unions, it was lawyers' unions, it was doctors' unions, journalists, everyone very organized. But now this, what they called these neighborhood groups, resistant committees, as they call them, are gradually becoming the target and being dismantled deliberately because there is a resentment that they are taking power or demanding for power on behalf of people rather than those who have the force of arms.
That's the heart of the matter. Now you tell me, in these regions that we speak of, the people who have held power, are they not people who predominantly have a military background?
Absolutely. So let's take Sudan, for example.
Yes.
The leaders of the two warring
parties. And the one before?
And the one before that.
Yes.
And the trigger for the current crisis is the fact that there was an intention to put up a timetable that will restore power to civilians.
Yes.
It's about power.
Precisely. And if you have a region where those who have held on to power for the longest time, even when they've removed their military garb and put on civilian clothing, are still military people.
Absolutely.
The likelihood of what we are seeing in this part of our continent is likely to continue, because these are people who will fight at the slightest provocation. Civilians don't think like that. They do.
Absolutely. And I would emphasize the point you made earlier about external forces and those who sell arms.
Yes.
They are pitching their tent with one side against the other because of what they stand to gain.
Yes.
And so you're in the case of Sudan, a lot of it is the Gulf countries.
Yes.
It's the United Arab Emirates. It's Saudi Arabia.
It's Qatar.
It's exactly. So you have all of this on one side or the other. Even if those within are willing to come to the table, and there is no willingness as we speak to come to the table. Rather, Hemeti is all over Africa, here in Kenya, red carpet rolled out for him. This is someone that has been credibly accused of carrying out atrocities against his own people. He is not a head of state, but he has a head of state rollout. When he comes visiting, he's done a diplomatic shuttle of about 8 African countries. He's gotten almost the same treatment all the way from the east to Central Africa, Rwanda, South Africa, Djibouti. Talk about it, he's been there. But he would not sit down with the person he's fighting with. So he, on the one hand, is saying it's the international community that can intervene, and without that intervention, we cannot have peace. But whereas the African Union, and I'll come back to what you said earlier, Ndu, the African Union has attempted to mediate, even through IGAD, to bring them to the table. They have not agreed. The Jeddah talks came to nothing. Every time one side hears that the other is attending an event, they denounce it. They will not attend. That's why I said it's about ego. And people are suffering. Now, the African Union has done, I think, what it can, but there is a lack of ability. There is a lack of capacity. Now, the one good thing that I think has happened recently, and I hope it becomes operationalized, that in December last year, the UN the UN Security Council passed a resolution to provide support to standing forces, including one for the African Union. I think that the African Union should take advantage of that and get the support. African countries are poor. They don't have enough to handle their political, economic, social. Many. There are some that are not poor. There are some that are not. But they are few. They are in the minority. We have, 58 countries in Africa? What percentage of that has enough to sustain life within their own borders, talk less of going next door or contribute? They don't even contribute their dues to the African Union.
And yet, they have millionaires and they have billionaires.
Private individuals, maybe with access with
political leaders,
presidents.
So corruption. Corruption is another.
And this is the
another
thing,
conversation,
because we're talking about poor African countries who go to Unga assemblies and spend $25,000 a night and
take
then put it
an
all over
entourage of
social
600
media
people
and take 50. And we have other countries in Africa who take 1,500 people to COP in Dubai.
Yeah.
So when we hear things like a phrase you used, small minorities who are perpetuating conflict that in a normal situation could be shut down. And that's what I'm saying, that we do not see the application of willingness and implementation in the resolve of some of these things. And we continue to use those buzzwords like small minorities who are the ones who are perpetuating this conflict, and the government who has the machinery, whether it is in will or actual infrastructure, kind of flirting with the issue of maybe we can resolve it when we can. And then we fall back on things like we don't have enough money or we don't have enough in terms of resources. But those that are available are not being employed. And that's one of my major issues with things like this. You study these conflicts, you see the way in which they develop. over time. Is it possible that for decades, 5, 6 decades, that we see the nature of conflict not changing in its nature, but that the perpetuation of it continues and that it is okay? For me, it's absolutely, it's anathema.
It's ludicrous.
That we see it continue like this and we fall back on things like small minority or inadequate resource. It cannot be.
The small minority are those who have access to that state machinery and the power of coercion. So you cannot divorce that small minority from the government you speak about. It's the monopoly of the use of force and power. Look at the conflict. There is not one conflict that the government forces are not involved. And that's what prolongs it. Whether you look at the Sahel, you're looking at the armed Islamist insurgencies, they are perpetrated because, one, people at some point, and it's all linked, people at some point get tired of the corruption, the neglect, the deliberate impoverishment of their communities, and look for a means of seizing some of that violence for themselves, and say the language that the government understands is the language of violence. Whether it's religion defined, some social cause, they will take up arms. And what is the government response? They round up everyone in the vicinity, thereby creating and perpetuating the narrative of grievance and of victimization. And so when people internalize that, they become the enemies of the state that's supposed to protect them. And so you have it, and like you said, there are cycles that we understand so well. The triggers are obvious. The early warnings are there, completely ignored, because again, it is the access to that coercive power that people want to protect by all means. They are not separate from each other. It's not one group of people somewhere and the government elsewhere. It's all interwoven.
And I'm back to the legacy and the tyranny of history. If that is what has been a consistent norm, interspersed with peace in between, the likelihood of it taking force and spiraling is always high. And as you say correctly, so long as that minority, and that's why the intelligentsia that you speak of in a place like Sudan understand this, because you live with it, and they know until we actually have an absolute civilian rule, this thing will never ever end.
It will never.
I've seen a comment here, and I think I agree with it 100%, that when we talk about conflict, we can't run away from talking about conflict without talking about the business and the commercialization of conflict, especially on the continent. Number two, I don't agree that the majority of African countries are poor. I think that African countries, to a large extent, are poorly managed. The poor management of resources, the poor implementation of certain things that actually can bring about a certain element of development that we do not see. And I think it is the management of processes that fails largely. And because of that, we continue to see this. Is it possible to be involved, to be in a country without the say-so of the citizens, or one or two? CT gives us an example here about the slave trade having flourished the way it did, not because people came in and did it, but that there was somebody on the ground who was facilitating it.
A lot of it was also conflict driven. It was conflict between communities, and slave taking and hostage taking has been part of historical humanity forever. And so when during the wars in Africa, when people, my enemy, if I fight them today, they can become stronger tomorrow. So why don't I sell off some of them and make something out of it? So it's the way that we generate and deal with conflict. And you talked about the war economy. It's always
just right there. Before, it was, one could even argue, a cultural process where people went to war, took slaves, intermarried to bring about peace. When the commercial element came in, Now, it spurred more conflict because it enabled you to have more merchandise to sell. The merchandise, unfortunately, were human beings.
Human beings.
Yes. So, what we're seeing is just a modern-day version of the same thing.
Absolutely.
Mausi, does this report look at the reasons for the inaction?
We delve into a lot of it. Like I mentioned earlier, I feel, we believe that there is some level of inability on the part of the African Union. They have limited resources, to be honest. I also mentioned the African Commission of Human and People's Rights. I mean, really excellent people in there, commissioners who are doing their best with very little or no resources at all. And so, getting them access to where the money is, the support is, the funds are, whether we're talking in terms of, the tools for forces who can go in. Listen, civilians, that's the critical thing in any war. And that's why there are laws of war. The laws of war say you must avoid indiscriminate or deliberate targeting of civilian populations, civilian infrastructure. All of these are thrown out. There is a new UN declaration, a political declaration about avoiding the use of explosives in populated places. 83 countries across the world have signed it. Just 10 in Africa, but you can be sure none of these countries who are in war are signing up to it. They are using explosive weapons in populated places in Sudan as we speak. In Khartoum, like I said, most of it has been bombed out. They're using drones. A lot of it supplied by the United Arab Emirates. That's the information that we're getting. And so some of the mechanisms that can help,
are lacking.
Including the genocide conventions, like I said, all of the laws of war, and we have absolutely amazing legal infrastructure here in Africa to ensure that those things do not happen. But what happens? Implementation. That's the problem.
So structurally, things are in place.
There are.
But then there's a lack of capacity.
Lack of capacity and lack of willingness to implement.
What leads to that lack of capacity?
The lack of capacity is access to resources.
Who has no access to resources?
The African Union.
Why?
It goes capping. That's a good question for the union to so, like I said, even members do not pay their dues. Where is it supposed to manufacture the resources from? So it's going outside of Africa to enlist aid when there are resources within Africa that could be applied to the use of this institution set up by Africans for Africans.
Therein lies the problem, because you've just touched on the leadership of these African countries. Again, let me go back to my earlier statement. How is it that all these leaders are multi-dollar millionaire or billionaires, and yet you're saying they cannot pay these dues?
They don't.
Precisely. The poverty of spirit, it bothers me. How is it that the African ascends to leadership and somehow doesn't seem to understand that his security lies in the welfare of his people? It seems to, they ascend, they talk about it as though they understand it, and then they ascend, and then they negate that entire conversation with their actions. How? Can someone explain this to me?
Can I?
Yes.
Ego. Male ego.
Why is it only in Africa?
It's everywhere else, but there are mechanisms to check it. What we don't have are the checks. Europe has NATO. The threat of NATO, or even the US, because the US is aligned with NATO. Although, Russia has called their bluff on Ukraine, but it is a check that works for most. And then they have the institutions that they respect. We don't respect our institutions. A lot of the institutions that we have and the mechanisms we have are copycat institutions and mechanisms. We don't believe in them. We don't support them. We don't fund them. That's the problem.
What would you like to see?
I would like to see an Africa that cares enough about its people to step in when they are being bullied, because all of this fighting, all of these individuals who are fighting themselves, and as they say, the African proverb says, when the elephant fights, it's the grass that suffers, and they have no protection. We would like to see better protections for African civilians caught amidst this conflict. Protection and then justice. For me, justice is key. Justice is key to the future. It's looking back, but it's key to the future, to ensuring that this does not continue to happen. So ensuring that there is accountability for what has happened and ensuring that civilians are protected. Those are the two key things we'd like to see happen.
Mausi, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Mausi Segun is the Executive Director at Human Rights Watch Africa Division. We've been talking about wartime atrocities and humanitarian crisis, repercussions of global inaction in the Horn of Africa, conflict, out of a report released yesterday by the Human Rights Watch called
The World Report.
World Report 2024. Keep it here for more conversations.
This is The Situation Room, the only way to start your day.